High culture is a term used to characterize the most privileged aspects of cultural production. Hierarchies exist in a number of cultural arenas, from literature to music to dance to the visual arts, which will be the focus of my talk today. Specifically, I'm interested in the ways that high culture operates within the context of public art museums, how public art museums perpetuate notions of high culture, and the present problem that many people, specifically young people, feel that museums are irrelevant or inaccessible. The goal of my talk is twofold. When I say get high culture, I want you to, one, understand the structure of high culture, so get as in understand, and two, to get high culture as in to go out and be inspired to pursue it in and through museums. So who determines what high culture is? High culture has always been defined by elite institutions and individuals that patronize art. The art that they commission, accept, and promote is considered high culture, and conversely, what they reject and deny is not. So in some historical contexts, the authority on high culture is the state, and sometimes that's embodied by a single individual, like a monarch, as was the case in ancient Egypt. So here's the very famous bust of Queen Nefertiti. In other contexts, the prevailing religious authority is also the authority on the visual arts. In Italy, during the period known as the Renaissance, the church was art's largest patron, and the church defined high culture within the visual arts as the art that promoted the interests, the temporal and spiritual powers of the church. And here's a portrait of Pope Leo X by Raphael from around 1517. In yet other historical contexts, there are designated cultural authorities, like academic institutions that are dedicated to the teaching and learning of art and its interpretation. In 17th century France, for example, the Academy of Painting and Sculpture established a hierarchy of art that placed so-called history painting at its apex. So depictions of historical, or mythological, or religious events were at the height of art. And this is a portrait of Charles Lebrun, who was a very influential director of that academy. In the present day, museums are widely acknowledged as the arbiters of high culture, manifest in the visual arts. They exercise a central role in defining high culture by collecting, preserving, and displaying what they deem to be the most significant cultural artifacts. They shape high culture by determining which art is museum-worthy. Museums have inherited many of the characteristics of the fundamentally elitist and exclusionary, by design, institutions that preceded them. However, unlike those institutions, museums depend on the participation and patronage of the public for their survival. Thus, the elite heritage of modern-day art museums is in many ways incompatible with its fundamentally democratic mission. This problem has manifested in a sort of crisis of high culture, one in which the perception that museums are inaccessible or irrelevant persists. Put simply, people have a hard time associating institutions that were born of elitism with openness and democracy, so they choose not to participate in them. There's been a lot of talk about this perceived disconnect between museums and the publics they're intended to serve. In preparing my talk, I came across an op-ed article by the art historian, professor, and curator Darby English entitled, "Don't Be Intimidated by Museums. They Belong to Everyone." It's perfectly germane to my topic. In this article, English describes what's called threshold fear, the reluctance to enter a space that is perceived as potentially threatening or uncomfortable because it's unfamiliar. And this is the reason why many people cite they're put off by museums. So when I finished reading the article, I couldn't resist looking at the comment section, and if any of you have ever been on the internet, you know that that's often a very regrettable idea. So there were indeed some very unpleasant and incoherent responses to the article, but there was one question in particular from a commenter that I found to be very insightful. And he asked, if museums are places of enjoyment, how can enjoyment be intimidating? It's a very good question. Certainly not all people experience threshold fear or are intimidated by museums, and people experience it to various degrees. But I know threshold fear exists because I've experienced it myself. So I'll tell a kind of embarrassing story. Especially because I'm someone who's decided to pursue a career in art history and in museums. When I was an undergraduate at Harvard, my entire freshman year, I never set foot into the museum on campus, the Fogg. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, to an art-loving and museum-going family. My mother took me to the Brooklyn Museum, which was in our neighborhood, very frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. Now that I look back on it, maybe it was a bit excessive. When I was in high school, and that's not me, by the way, I would even cut school sometimes to spend the day wandering through the vast Metropolitan Museum or walking up the winding ramp of the Guggenheim or exploring MoMA, where I'm privileged to currently work, or the Whitney, or going back to my old haunt, the Brooklyn Museum. It wasn't then much of a surprise that in college I decided to pursue art history as my major. Yet, as I've confessed, for my entire freshman year, I never once set foot into the museum that's on campus. It wasn't until towards the end of the year there was an event where undergrads had the opportunity to meet graduates of the college who had degrees in the fields of their interest. So I was very thrilled to meet someone who studied art history and actually got a job in museums. And this woman suggested that we both go to the Fogg to see what was on view. So, of course, I embarrassedly admitted that I'd never been. When we went to the museum, it was actually closed. But the very next day, I marched in confidently, knowing that it was silly for me to have not gone to the museum on my own campus, because by the end of the year, I didn't view Harvard's campus as an alien place. I viewed it as my campus. So the lesson here is that threshold fear can be overcome by developing a sense of ownership of the museums and other cultural institutions in our communities. However, developing this sense of ownership is more difficult for some than for others for historical reasons. People are hesitant to enter places that have historically excluded them. In a speech she gave at the opening ceremony for the new building that houses the that's home to the Whitney Museum of American Art, First Lady Michelle Obama discussed the historical exclusion, legal and de facto, of people of color from museums and its impact on their current participation in museums. Museums continue to be perceived as white social spaces, and statistics suggest that by and large they are. So even as the percentage of the American population that identifies as minority increases, shifting towards the much talked about minority majority, their numbers within museums have dwindled. The troubling fact that museum visitors don't reflect the diversity of the communities they're intended to serve is reflected in the demographics of museum professionals as well. A 2015 Mellon Foundation Art Museum Staff Demographic Survey found that though minorities represent 38% of the American population, only 16% of positions in museums that are associated with leading the intellectual missions of the museums are held by them. So directors, curators, conservators, educators, and the like. The crisis of high culture in this sense, the inequity that's felt across racial and related socioeconomic lines, is also experienced generationally. So education, or lack thereof, is a key reason for the generational divide in museum participation and engagement. Arts education is routinely slashed from curricula, and it follows that the lack of a basis of knowledge of the arts would distance young people from museums. We all avoid experiences which we feel require specialized knowledge that we lack. Moreover, fear can make us resistant to learning. So I have another embarrassing story about this. When I was a very young child, I did not want to learn how to read. One of the strategies that my mother used to get me to learn how to read was that she purchased these narratively structured picture books. So I would flip through the pages and recite a story out loud based on my interpretation of the images. But of course, there was a point where I had to learn how to read text, and I was adamant that I did not need to learn how to read because I could always read images. So ironically, I didn't want to learn how to read because of my love for books. So she said, and my mother has a flair for the dramatic, "What will you do if one day someone writes on a wall, 'Read this or die'?" Now, that's a pretty harsh image to paint in the mind of a child, but my mother had a point. I learned how to read after that. The hypothetical death threat might seem overblown, but if I had remained obstinately illiterate, I would have cut myself off from vast bodies of knowledge. Moreover, I would have severely hindered my ability to express myself because reading and writing go hand in hand. Likewise, when we don't engage with cultural institutions like museums, we are choosing to remain culturally illiterate to a certain extent. We exclude ourselves from the enduring narratives that these institutions create and perpetuate. We also relinquish the power to tell our own stories. We miss out on being enriched by high culture, and we separate ourselves from enriching high culture with our unique perspectives. Remember, like the monarchs, the clergy, and the academics of old, museums currently define high culture as manifest in the visual arts. But unlike their predecessors, museums are responsive institutions. In fact, they need our participation to function. They can only be as exclusionary as you or I allow them to be. In public art museums, we are invited and empowered to participate in the definition and redefinition of high culture. Changes are underway, and we can all be part of them. We need to learn how to develop a sense of ownership over the institutions in our communities and embrace rather than resist the kinds of knowledge that museums offer, because they allow us to explore our histories and to learn more about ourselves. We need to get high culture because it belongs to us. Thank you.